Hello, and welcome to the Wild Blue Podcast, perspectives on aviation lives, lifestyles, and business.
Hi, Chris Kirk here at Wild Blue Aircraft Sales with Todd Minton. Hi, Todd.
Hey, Chris. How are you today?
Hey, we're doing good. We were just going to have a little bit of fun here today, talking about some of the more fun and challenging airports that you and I have been in. I know a lot of people have a lot of fun stories about that. I think for me, what I hope that people get out of this is just some things to think about in their pre-flight planning that maybe they hadn't thought about in the past, and how it's going to impact not only planning but airplane performance and so forth. So
yeah, it sounds like a fun topic, and of course we can talk from a airline perspective, from a general aviation perspective. There's a lot of topics we could cover, a lot of airports,
military perspective as well.
Yeah, that's true.
It's one of the things I was just sitting here thinking about it, because when I flew the T-38, that airplane had had some very interesting takeoff and landing performance, because it had no anti-lock brakes, it had no spoilers, the tire footprint was very, very small, coupled with slick tires. They didn't have any tread or grooving on them, and the speed at which that airplane would hydroplane, especially if you were on non-grooved runways, it was really made for some challenging locations, even if on the surface it didn't look like it was going to be that challenging.
Now, Chris, I like to fly my RV-8, which I consider a fighter, at 72 knots on final and touchdown at 65. Is that similar to what the T-38 did?
What would you say, 75?
72 knots on final.
So it'd be a little less than half.
Oh, wow. I've heard stories that 38, you guys were fast.
Yep, 155 knots plus gas. So if my memory serves me correctly, this has been a while, for every 100 pounds over 1,000 pounds of gas, we added a knot. So if we had 2,000 pounds of gas, your final approach speed would be 165.
Sure.
Now that's a full flap setting. We also did no flap. We didn't do landings no flap, but we did no flap approaches, and we did no flap touch and goes. And that speed was 170 plus gas. So if you had 2,500 pounds of gas,
add 15.
You'd add 15, and that doesn't account for adding for gusty winds.
185 plus.
185 plus. So sometimes you'd have pretty doggone high. I mean, if memory serves me correctly, it was the fastest landing airplane in the Air Force inventory.
Yeah.
So it had some. It was Category E on approaches.
Oh, yeah. Now you notice, I will point out, Chris, since I was a navigator, I could quickly work that math out of my head. I'm curious how you pilots managed to figure that out.
It was a challenge, man. Trying to fit the 4-foot abacus in this 3-foot cockpit. It was tough.
Well, I wondered how you did it. I didn't know you had an abacus in there for sure, but that
take our boots off and count our toes.
I knew it. So now that definitely was limited, and you had to have those big 10,000-foot Air Force runways. But what are some of the other shorter runways that you've flown jets into and challenging airports?
Well, I think one of the more challenging airports that people don't think about, for those of us here in Kansas City, is our home airport here at downtown Kansas City.
Yes.
They used to fly. I remember as a kid coming down here and watching 707s land. But, even just in a GA airplane, one of the things that we always have to think about as tenants at this airport is if you lose an engine, where are you going to go?
Yes.
Single engine. Because there's really no place to go. I know I tell my family this, and I remind them all the time. Be prepared to go swimming, because sometimes the more safe option is going to be trying to land close to the banks on that river. And we're going to need to make sure the door's popped and everybody's ready to get out pretty short order.
I will say that those of you that know me know that it always pains me to say something nice about Chris, but Chris does a very a real thorough briefing and flies his Piper Saratoga with the precision that he flies a 737 for Delta Airlines. So that is, I do respect that very much, and I've learned, when I fly with you, watching how you handle that, and I think that a lot of pilots could learn from that, because you're right. Thinking here, coming off of Kansas City, MKC, Mike Kilo Charlie, for those that aren't familiar or from here, There's buildings, tall buildings to the southwest. There's
towers that are tough to see.
Yeah, the big tall towers, 2,000 footers. Well, the MSL anyway. And certainly no place to land, so the river might be a spot. Yeah, this is a challenge. You're right about that.
We've got that rail yard that's on the east side here. There's absolutely no place over there to set it down.
No.
You got a little bit of space, I guess, between the levee and the river, but barring being in the middle of the town somewhere, there's just not a lot of options.
No, there's not. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners face that with their home airports. At least some areas, and hopefully you plan ahead and think like Chris is talking about. Think about what am I going to do if I lose an engine at this point or on final, wherever it may be. So yeah, great one to start with there. We sticking with the general aviation theme. What airports might we also want to discuss that we're familiar with?
I know a lot of the guys, folks that are out there in high country, Idaho, backcountry. There's lots of cool strips that you and I have never flown into.
No, unfortunately not.
They've got their folklore surrounding those airports. One of the closest ones around here that I haven't even flown into, and I think you said you hadn't, is Gaston's. And that's pretty challenging. When we lived down in Texas, I used to go in and out of a place called McGeehee's Catfish Farm right off the Red River, and little narrow strip with a road that went halfway between it, and the one end of the runway was pretty darn close to the restaurant. And the first time I went in there, I was with my father-in-law in our 172. This has been 20-some years ago, and my son, well, not 20, it'd been 18 years ago. He was just a baby. We had him in the car seat in the back, and he and I and Ethan took off to go fly. We wanted to go up there, and I'd heard stories about it, Did a low pass, kind of check it out ahead of time, which I'm really glad that I did. But what you don't see on the low pass is some of the kind of the undulating or, the curvy spots in the runway. And we landed and crossed that road, and I thought the nose gear was going to come off that airplane, But that was fun. It was fun, but I was glad that I had plenty of performance left. We were pretty light, didn't have a lot of gas, just the three of us, and it was the older 172, so it had pretty good climbing performance.
Lots of narrow runways, and you're right. You brought up a point where guys like up in Idaho or certainly in Alaska, that some of this is not as challenging to them, but to those of us flatlanders here, airports, narrow runways right here in the Kansas City area. We have Roosterville. Now, fortunately, there's grass on either side, but the actual paved part is maybe 20 feet wide.
Right.
That's kind of a fun little challenge.
It's got a little bit of a jink in it, too, doesn't it?
It does. A little jink never hurts, And as long as it's not a whole chicane, just a little turn, we can live with that. There's a lot of good videos out there of guys landing at challenging airports, too. How about in the airline world? I know, I fly more international right now, 777. We don't do a lot of international stuff. I mean, a lot of challenging airports in that airplane, but you're in a 737 and in and out of a lot of airports here in the U.S.
Yeah, and some of them are, the key is being prepared ahead of time and knowing what you're getting into. And so fortunately in the airline world, things are a little more structured, where we've got, engineering departments at the airlines that look at these things in terms of how's the airplane going to perform in various circumstances and stuff. And so we've got a lot of guidance on that, and obviously a lot of operations into and out of these places. But one of the first things that we always look at is whether or not the runway is grooved. GA pilots, I think by and large, don't tend to think about that. But that grooving on a runway removes a lot of water, and it reduces a lot of the risk that you face going in there.
Yes.
Because like you were talking about earlier, you can go into what's seemingly a nice long runway, and if it's not grooved, and if they had a storm in there, there's a lot of opportunity to go off the end of that runway hydroplaning.
And I think that's true even in general aviation airplanes, where if it's a shorter, the runway's not going to be grooved in many cases in general aviation, and it's something to think about. If you're, sometimes a really hard rain goes through and then it suddenly kind of clears right behind it. Not necessarily clear skies, but the visibility's good. It's like the rain cleaned everything out, and you get in, oh man, we timed this just right. We got down here just as the rain moved out, and we can sneak in VFR, and it's fine. but that runway could have quite a bit of standing water on it, and puddles and so on. So it doesn't happen often, but it can happen.
I don't know if you've seen it too. It's like Murphy's Law. If there is no grooving on that runway, you can be darn sure that the runway's not crowned. It's going to be flat, and it is going to hold water.
That's a fact. Years ago, down in Guatemala, Guatemala City, I haven't been there in years now, but that airport at that time was not grooved. And they had one or two airplanes. There's some accidents that you can check out on YouTube or read about of airplanes that overran the runway down in Guatemala City on landing after a rainstorm. Exactly what we're talking about. I've got a great story I got to interject here about.
I'd love to hear it.
I was flying. My first airline job was for a third level freight carrier flying old run out DC-8s and not it. I mean, first generation jet, great airplane, cool airplane, but a first generation jet. And we took off out of Guatemala City. Well, I should back up a moment. This particular 61, DC-8 61 was having a cargo door issue, and they'd stuck a pin in there as sort of a backup to hold the cargo door. I mean, but the door closed and locked, and we'll be fine. We launched out of Guatemala City and climbing out of, 24,000 feet. We hear this boom, a big thump. I don't know how that comes across on our microphone, but a boom. What was that? And flight engineer gets up. I was first officer. Flight engineer gets up, goes back and says, our cargo door has popped a little bit. That pin that they had stuck in there was what kept it from coming all the way open.
Yeah.
So we turned around, went back to Guatemala City, which was not my favorite place to land to begin with, but landed and they fixed it. But whenever I think of Guatemala City, I'm reminded of that particular trip there that presented its own unique challenges.
Yeah, I don't remember. Did that airplane have spoilers? Did it have landing spoilers?
Yeah, it did.
It did.
Yep.
Okay. Did it have leading edge slats?
No, it did not.
It did not. Okay. So it had probably pretty good approach speeds, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think around 140 knots, something like that. It's hard to remember, but that was 25 years ago plus. So yeah. Back to our more on topic though, some of the other airports within the U.S. that I think LaGuardia is a challenging airport, isn't it?
Yeah, I hate LaGuardia. And it has, it's just so many feet.
No, Chris, we're talking about the runways here.
Yeah, not a fan, but it is, it's a challenging airport for a variety of reasons. It's landlocked. The ends of two of the runways are built on piers that go out into, the East Bay that's right there by Rikers Island. Mm-hmm. And so those ends of the runways, just like driving on a bridge in the wintertime, right? They'll freeze earlier. And so you might think you have good stopping distance, and then you hit that last little bit, and there's all that cold air circulating underneath that runway, and that part will be frozen if they haven't treated it. And runways are short; they're 7,000 feet long. All these people buy houses and things, and they don't want the noise around there, and everything.
Well, so you do that expressway visual following.
Yeah.
I think that's an important point to bring up. Is that the thought process might be airline flying is the hardest decision of the day is whether you take the ILS to the left or the ILS to the right, and meaning the runway 17 left or 17 right. But in fact, a lot of airports that we'll discuss today are airports that actually have a challenging approach, and you're expected to fly the visual approach or the approach that does the least noise impact, which you brought up. So
yeah, that expressway visual is a great example. So it's one of those where you're visually flying over whatever that expressway is there that goes down Long Island. Yep. You reach a point which happens to be right around, Citi Field, they call it now, which is where the Mets play.
Yep.
And you hang a very sharp left-hand turn to line up, and that would be runway 31. And the challenge there is from a big airplane perspective. First off, you're maneuvering this big airplane in a pretty short or pretty small area, and if you have winds that are overshooting, causing you to kind of go past the runway, and if you're not right on glide slope, there's a lot of little maneuvering that needs to be done that generally, in a small airplane, it's pretty easy to take care of. You can slip the airplane in. You can do any number of things that aren't going to be an issue. But when you're flying an 80 or 90 ton or more airplane down through there, it's one of those things that, and you're sitting cross cockpit, not to mention trying to look out the other guy's window to see all this. If you're the FO in that case, it's challenging.
Well, sticking in the New York area, it just occurred to me, and on these approaches, obviously one of the most well-known approaches in the entire world, the Canarsie. into Kennedy, JFK. It's the approach that we fly into 3-1 left.
Yep.
And that's a challenging one in a wide body airplane, and a lot of foreign carriers, a lot of it's again, hardly the ILS to
right.
in a big wide air. You think of Kennedy as being a huge airport, but it's still, they got you packed in tight.
Yep. Well, DCA is the same way. You fly the river visual going to 1-9 and DCA, and you're flying down the Potomac all visual, trying to meet your altitude targets, and then there's no such thing as a traditional stabilized approach there. I mean, you're literally rolling out on final at 250 feet, maybe. On an airplane that's got 100+ foot wingspan, you're pretty close to the ground.
I think a fantastic way to spend a day would be a crosswind day, watching guys do landings there on 1-9 at Reagan DCA. That would be a ball to just sit and watch that. Aviation guys like us would like that sort of thing.
Well, I always get a kick out of the know-it-all passenger in the back. Well, it was kind of a hard landing. Yeah. That wasn't a good landing. Pilot. Yeah, and they have no clue.
Wow.
And you're not looking for a smooth landing. You're looking for a landing that gets you down on the numbers because it's a 6,800 foot runway.
Yeah.
And you want to be able to stop that thing and turn off, and that's the good landing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Another, talking about short runways. How about Orange County? You guys go there a lot, I bet.
Yeah, I haven't gone in there in quite a while, but that's what 50. I don't remember how much it was, but we used to have a briefing that they wanted us to give the passengers to forewarn them about takeoffs more than landings.
Yes, that was great. In the Navy, both of us had flown the MD-80 in and out of Orange County.
You had to run the power up to a certain EPR setting.
Yep.
And on the 90 that we flew in there, it had an auto cutback feature. So you'd pre-select it in the FMS, but you'd haul down the runway in max power generally. You'd rotate, hoping that you didn't lose an engine, because you knew darn well you weren't going to stop before the end of the runway.
Yeah. And it's right there. The runway, by the way, is what, 5,400 feet?
Yeah, it's not very long. You'd hit that 800-foot level, and then here all of a sudden the airplane had announced cutback, and the throttles had come way back. And you'd nose it over because the guy that lives out there at the end of the runway and wants the convenience of the airport doesn't want the noise, and he'd raise a fit over it. So you're doing things that frankly just are marginally safe at best, I think.
The interesting thing about like Orange County is I flew out there in the 80, and then I flew it in the 757, and the best part about that, much bigger airplane, you'd think, oh boy, but that's even more challenging. Now, for our listeners who are familiar, the 7.5 has got so much power and such a great wing that it was actually a piece of cake. It was a non-event. I mean, non-event.
That's a great airplane.
Just such a great airplane, and makes short runways easy work. So.
One that I guarantee you probably none of our listeners have ever been into, though, Todd, is Guantanamo Bay. Tell us about that one.
Yeah. I've been in Guantanamo Bay both in the C-130 and in the DC-8. And my understanding today is they've changed it now. But the thing that made Guantanamo Bay, which if you're not familiar with it, is a little slice of Cuba that belongs to the U.S. Of course, probably through the war on terror stuff, a lot of alleged terrorists were put into prison there in Gitmo, Guantanamo Bay. Well, flying in there, you're right there in Cuban airspace. It's just a little tip on southern and southeastern Cuba that we own somehow, and so we would coming in there, you had to stay inside the fence, whatever the fence was, which was a place that started where you weren't supposed to be flying over. So that was it was made for a very short final. So, you know, the C-130, not a big deal, but in the DC-8, that was a challenge to get in there, stay inside that thing, keep it all in sight. Not unlike what you're talking about LaGuardia, where you're trying to maybe look cross cockpit or whatever it may be, but you turned a short final and got in there. The runway itself was fine, but the approach was the challenge at Guantanamo Bay.
Mm-hmm.
Another South American airport that I did only in the C-130, but American Airlines does fly there, and it's a special claw airport, is Tegucigalpa, Honduras. That's and there's some good videos online of airplanes coming in over, because there's a hill on final. It used to even be a shorter runway back in the 90s when I went in there, and it was a challenge to come in over the hill. There was actually an Air Force Reserve C-130 that crashed there in the mid 90s too, and that was an unfortunate incident. Lost a few lives on that, but you can't land halfway down that runway, even in a C-130, at least at that time, and stop the airplane. So
yeah,
very challenging and unique airport. Tango Golf uniform, Tegucigalpa.
You know, terrain is one of those things that it's easy to say, but it's difficult to put into practice in terms of flight planning for it near the airport.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to get a visual for what you're seeing. You know, one of the GA airports that I've been in recently that kind of caught me off guard and brought this more to my attention is, I think is it Phelps Field in Spokane, the one that's the GA airport that's to the east, kind of between Spokane and Coeur d'Alene. And there's a huge hill just on the north side of the runway. Well, if you're coming in there, especially at night, and I was glad this was daytime so I could see all this, but if you were coming in and weren't aware of this big hill, it doesn't really show up that prominent on the chart. I mean, it's there, but it's kind of unremarkable on the chart. But if you're at 1,000-foot pattern altitude, it takes away a good 400 or 500 feet.
Wow.
And then there's a house up there, as I recall. So it's one of those things where you need to spend a little bit of time looking at these things and trying to visualize, okay, what is that 1,500-foot tower? What's that going to look like to me? What's that hill that's right there? What's that going to look like to me? And I think a lot of folks don't give that the justice that it deserves.
Brings up some good advice too, and if you are flying at night, and the U.S. military, I'm sure all airlines have the policy that you'll use all of available nav aids even on a visual approach.
That's a good point. Yep.
At night, and so I think we can all, as general aviation pilots, keep that in mind too. And take a look at a instrument approach plate. If you're instrument rated, know how to read the instrument approach plate, and use whatever aids are available to help you.
Yeah.
Especially at night.
Yeah, little things like don't descend below the final approach fixed altitude until you're inbound, even on a visual. Don't or use either your LPV guidance or your ILS guidance as a glide slope, even on a visual, especially at night.
Some places will surprise you too around the country if you haven't been there. Man, I never knew there was this much terrain in this given area. There's airports that just makes me think Northwest Arkansas, down there around Fayetteville, stuff like that. That area, there's a lot of terrain down there that may not be obvious to a person that isn't from.
But where was it you and I were? I mean, we were just down in
Sallisaw,
Oklahoma, and you got that big hill down there at the end of that runway.
Yes, that was crazy. Who would think Oklahoma? But it's eastern Oklahoma, right there next to Arkansas, and yeah, it's a factor.
Yeah,
absolutely, is a factor.
Well, there's a lot of cool ones. We're going to wrap this segment up, but if you have anything to throw in here, we'd love to hear from you on it, and any other topics of conversation that might be enjoyable to you. But again, Chris and Todd here at Wild Blue, we'd love to visit with you about either the sale or purchase of an airplane. We love working with buyers and sellers both, and really have just a thrill doing that. So our phone number is 816-479-2723, or you can check us out at flywildblue.com. And until next time, thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Wild Blue Podcast. Find us online at flywildblue.com. And don't forget to subscribe and share.